The title of our lesson today is Then God Saw, a line we find in the 6th chapter of the book of Genesis that deals with the Lord preparing to destroy the world through the great flood as a result of men's great sins. In Genesis 6 and verse 5, then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. The Lord saw two things about man that gives us an idea of what God sees and what God knows. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 5, the devil, speaking to the woman Eve, says, "For God knows that in that day you eat of it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Even the devil knew there's something special about this God of yours. He knows things that no man or woman could possibly know. And he may be the prince of darkness, but he knows this about God. God knows things that man can't know. And in Genesis 6, verses 5 and 6, the first thing we see is that God sees man's actions. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth. Next, God sees this. He sees the thoughts of man's heart. How difficult is that? If Horace was to pull out a knife and start stabbing the preacher today, it wouldn't be hard for you to say, "I see wickedness." Horace is doing something evil. We can see that man's wickedness upon the earth is great. But how many of us can say this? We can even see that every intent of the thoughts of man's heart is evil continually. Who would know what man is thinking? Who would know the motives of a man's heart but God alone? So the question is, does God see these things in general as he looks down upon mankind? And the answer is no, that's not what we're seeing. Instead, he sees the deeds and the thoughts of each man as an individual. He knew every man who was evil and every man who was righteous. How do we know this to be the truth? Well, if we read down in verse 8, Noah found grace in the eyes of God, and God could have not made that determination about Noah unless he was capable of making the same determination about all men. God didn't just find one man, Noah. He found grace in the eyes of God because he was righteous. And generally speaking, the rest of you guys aren't any good, so I'm going to condemn all of you. That wouldn't work with God, would it? The reason God knew that Noah was righteous and Noah could find grace in the eyes of God is because God has made an individual determination about this one man and the way this one man lives, and he's made that same determination about all men, and they weren't like Noah. Let's turn to John chapter 4 and find some other things that God knows or God sees. John chapter 4, you recognize this starting in verse 9. He's dealing with the Samaritan woman at the well. The woman of Samaria said to Jesus, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." And Jesus answered and said to her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." And the woman said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as well as his sons and his livestock?" And Jesus answered and said to her, Whoever drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst, but the water that I shall give him will become in him a fountain of water, springing up into everlasting life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water that I may not thirst, nor come here to draw." And Jesus said to her, "Go call your husband and come here." And the woman answered and said, "I have no husband." And Jesus said to her, "You have well said, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you have now is not your husband, and that you spoke truly." And the woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet." Notice a couple of things about this when we consider what God knows. First, they've been carrying on this discussion, but under no conditions have they discussed each other's family life. This discussion of your family and your marriages and your past has never come up. I didn't need to query you about this matter to know you, and I know this about you. I can tell you truthfully, you've had 5 husbands. How would a man know that? Not only that, but the man you live with now, you're not married to. And this statement has overwhelmed this woman to the point that she says, "I perceive you're a prophet. I perceive you have some kind of miraculous power. Because I didn't tell you that, and I don't know of anyone else who told you that, and we're complete strangers. I'm at this well, and you're at this well, and we do not know each other, and yet you know this about me. I've had 5 husbands, and I'm living with a man now that I'm not married to." Who would know those things about a man or a woman? But God, who sees all things, just as he did in Genesis 6 and verse 5. Skip ahead in the same chapter to verses 28 and 29. The woman left her water pot at the well, went her way into the city, and said to the men, "Come, see a man who told me all things that I ever did. Could this be the Christ? How is it possible that this man knows all these things about me? He told me everything I ever did." When we stop and think about the greatest miracles that God has ever performed, how would you answer the question? What's your favorite miracle? When you study the Bible and you see the miracles of God, the signs and wonders, which one sticks out to you above all others? Was it the making the blind to see? Jesus' healing of the 10 lepers? Was it the parting waters of the Red Sea? Was it one of the 10 plagues? It'd be hard to define one. It's hard to pick just one because the miracles are so far and above anything that we could think about or see or do. It's just amazing that God has that kind of power. Well, imagine this kind of power. It's kind of a hidden miracle, if you will. God told this woman everything you've ever done. He knows every husband you've ever had. And he knows the man you have now you have no right to because you're not married to him. And I can tell you all these things about yourself because I am the Christ and because I know these things about you. Next in John chapter 6, nearby, verses 8 through 15, the miraculous feeding of the 5,000. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to Jesus, "There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are they among so many? We got a lot of people here to feed, and we're not going to get this job done with this little lad's little bit of food." And Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, in number about 5,000. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of the fish as much as they wanted. And when they were filled, Jesus said to his disciples, "Gather up the fragments that remain so that nothing is lost." I've given you this before. It's an interesting thing to consider. Imagine being a follower of Christ, and he takes these fishes and these fragments of bread, and miraculously he turns them into such a feast that the people can't eat all of the food they have access to. And so the disciples were told, "Gather up the fragments that remain." Because the Lord has performed here a miracle in front of all these witnesses, the number of men 5,000. He fed thousands of people from this little bitty food supply in which they started. And so, verse 13, they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the barley loaves which were left over by those who'd eaten. When you were there in that audience and you saw the Lord work like this, you've seen a notable miracle. Not that he's ever performed any miracles that are not notable. But watch this next miracle. Then those men, verse 14, when they'd seen the sign that Jesus did, said, "Truly this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Therefore Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force and make him king, and he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. I know what you guys are fixing to do. I know what's on your mind. I know your agenda. And I don't want that. Jesus was similarly taken by the Pharisees and scribes later when he was handed over to Pilate for trial. These men want to take the Lord by force, just as the Pharisees did, but their agendas are exactly the opposite. The Pharisees want to take him by force so he can be tried and ultimately crucified, but these people are so moved by a miracle, by the eating of these fish and the eating of this bread, that they've decided this is the King, the Messiah, the Christ who is to come, and let's take him by force so that we can treat him honorably and make him a king. But that wasn't the will of God. But imagine this seemingly little tiny miracle. I know what this whole crowd is thinking. I know what you want to do with me. I know what's on your mind, and I know what your game plan is. And he departed by himself into the mountains. Later in the same chapter, verses 22 through 26, on the following day, when the people who were standing on the other side of the sea saw that there was no other boat there except that the one which his disciples had entered, and that Jesus had not entered the boat with his disciples, but his disciples had gone away alone. However, other boats came from Tiberias near the place where they ate bread after the Lord had given thanks. And when the people therefore saw that Jesus was not there, nor his disciples, they got into boats and came to Capernaum seeking Jesus. And when they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, "Rabbi, when did you come here?" And Jesus answered them and said, "Most assuredly I say to you, you seek me, not because you saw the signs, but because you ate of the loaves and were filled." Here's another miracle of sorts. We overlook these things. We don't treat them as miracles, but it's an example of the Lord's super power of knowledge, that he could read your minds and read your hearts. Oh, I know that you seek me all right because you're here. And I know that you came here seeking me. You're telling me a partial truth, but let me tell you the whole truth. The reason you're really here is because you wanted something to eat. The reason you really came to me is because you remember the miracle the day before when I gave you all that food to eat, and you want more food to eat. That's the reason you're really here. You didn't seek me because you saw the signs. That miracle didn't move you spiritually so you could be around me more and learn more and seek the truth and learn more about God. In fact, you came here as a result of my spiritual powers to seek your physical fulfillment. I want some more to eat. I like this guy. He's good to hang around. You don't go hungry when you're around Jesus, and you don't even have to work for it. But how would he know that? Because he is God, and because he knows all things. He sees all things, and he could read even the thoughts of our minds and our hearts, just as Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 and 6 show us. If you'll go back to Matthew chapter 22 and verses 15 through 18. The Pharisees went and plotted how they might entangle him in his talk. And they sent to him their disciples with the Herodians, saying, Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God in truth, nor do you care about anyone, meaning you're not a respecter of persons, for you do not regard the person of men. Tell us, therefore, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? They've kind of buttered him up. They've paved the way for a soft landing. Teacher, oh yes, you've got my attention. You're giving me some respect. We know that you are true. That's a fact. And we know that you teach the way of God in truth. Oh, you're buttering me up all right. I wonder if I'll fall for this, if I may speak for the Lord. Not quite. Verse 18, Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, Why do you test me, you hypocrites? We came to you with smiles. We came to you with honor and reverence. Our Lord, our God, we know who you are. We know you teach the way of truth. We know this about you. We know that about you. We know you are great. We've lifted you up as well as we can through vocalization. Now tell us what you think about these taxes to Caesar. Is it lawful or not? And Jesus said, Wait just a minute, Pharisees. Before we address that subject, let me tell you what I know about you. You're wicked. And you're trying to trick me. And you're a bunch of hypocrites. Don't you wish you could know that every time you're a bank president and somebody comes in to borrow money and you could tell, right, you got a bunch of lies on this application right here. Every time you're teaching school and your children turn in a term paper and you can tell, I can just tell from looking at this that you've cheated. I can tell just from talking to you, I can perceive that you're not being honest. How many people would like to have that ability? It would keep us from being conned. That's the kind of power that Jesus has. Now here's the question. Does he have that power in Genesis 6? Does he have that power in Matthew 22 with the Pharisees? Does he have that power with the 5,000 he fed in John 6? Does he have that power with the Samaritan woman in John 4? And now that power has been laid to rest and he doesn't know us like he knew them. Would you think that? Of course not. He knows our deeds and he knows the thoughts of our heart. He knows who came here today to worship him and who came here today just to make an appearance at church because it's expected of me. In 1 John 3, verses 18 through 20, My little children, let us not love in word or in tongue. You see how compatible that is with what we're studying today in the Bible class in the book of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4? Did we talk about this today? You see, Horace and I, we sit around cross-legged on his house floor, and we burn some incense, and we set the campfire, and we just get real spiritual, and we work together and kind of figure out, here's what you're teaching and here's what I'm teaching, and we'll complement each other. Horace and I haven't seen each other in 14 days. Almost. I have no clue what he's teaching this morning. He has no clue what I'm teaching today. But did you see the compatibility? That's the power of God's providence working among us. Let us not love in word or in tongue, but in deed and in truth. And by this we know that we are of the truth, and shall assure our hearts before him. For if our heart condemns us, God is greater than our heart and knows all things. He knows all things. This lesson has a two-pronged attack. One, I hope that it scares some in the audience straight. I hope we think about, God knows everything I do. He knows everything I think. He knows what the intentions of my thoughts are. He knows me better than I could know myself. I need to get myself right with God. That's the first thing I hope this lesson rings today. And the second is, I hope that this lesson helps us understand how well God indeed knows us. So if we have problems that need to be dealt with, we can take these problems to him. If we're having problems in our homes, if we're having problems with our faith in our jobs, if we're not living right, we're struggling with sin, God is greater than our heart. He knows all things, and we can take those matters up to him and rest assured we've done the right thing by doing that, because he knows it all. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, Paul writing about a vision that he had once. He didn't know much about how he had the vision. He just knew that he had a vision. And watch what he says. It is doubtless not profitable for me to boast. I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, speaking of himself, whether in the body I do not know, or whether out of the body I do not know, God knows. Such a one was caught up to the third heaven. And I know such a man, whether in the body or out of the body I do not know, but God knows. There are things we don't know about ourselves that God knows. There are things that happen to us and we don't understand why, but God knows. I'll skip that passage, Matthew chapter 10, verses 28 through 31, but it's a great passage about where the Bible teaches that God has numbered the hairs on our head. That's what God knows. That's what God sees. That's how much God knows us. And we'll close today by going to the Hebrew letter in chapter 4 for a reading from verses 9 through 13. Hebrews 4, verses 9 through 13. There remains, therefore, a rest for the people of God. For he who has entered his rest has himself also ceased from his works, as God did from his. Let us therefore be diligent to enter that rest, lest anyone fall according to the same example of disobedience. For the word of God is living and powerful, and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the division of soul and spirit, and of joints and marrow, and is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart. There's some deep things to think about. What does God see? What does God know? He can discern the thoughts and intents of our hearts. Verse 13, and there is no creature hidden from his sight, but all things are naked and open to the eyes of him to whom we must give account. It will be a serious matter, ladies and gentlemen, as we know, to stand before God one day. He will know our deeds. He will know our thoughts. He will know the intents of our heart. If we have anyone here today who's not in a right relationship with God, we want to encourage you to take advantage of this opportunity that God has given us. If there's any spiritual need that you have that the church can help you with, we want to encourage you to stand while we sing and come to the front.